ってらっしゃるじゃないですか。でウルトラで、監督をするとしたらどんなストーリーとかちゃんとあります？
いや僕はもう地球防衛軍というかそういうのをちゃんとやりたいです、ね。
ちゃんと。
組織を
そこだけ。
組織をやりたいですね。
あ、組織を。
ああいう組織が実在するとどうなるんだろうというのをシミュレーションでやっていきたいと思いますけどね。
ああ、そうですか。
最終的には出なくてもいいんですけど。
何が？
ウルトラマンとか。もう最後にワンカットでもいいですけど。勝手なこと言って。
俺はねやっぱり侵略者とかいいですけどね。宇宙人が侵略してくるとかそういうことっていうのをちゃんと。
バルタンとかああいう感じの。
であったりもしかしたらウルトラマンそのものが善意の侵略者かもしれないっていう。たまたまウルトラマンって一番素晴らしいなと思うのってウルトラマンを受け入れる世界だと思うんですよ。実に見事な。いまだにあんな世界は実現してないしそ
れはそうだけどね、
人間はとりあえず一丸となってるっていうようななんかこう平和な世の中ってのはできていない以上今この世の中にウルトラマンが来てもじゃあそれって何を役割として何するのとか、そういうのはすごくこう突き詰めていくと逆に今の人間というものをちゃんとこう照らし出せるんじゃないかなというのはよく考えはするんですけど、でもそれってウルトラマンじゃねえよなっていう。
そうだね。
Anno. From Ultraman's debut in 1966 to the modern day, the Giant of Light has continued to spark imaginations across many generations. One man who was in the generation that first saw Ultraman was Hideaki Anno. He appreciated the craft that went into the tokusatsu he saw, but most of all, in Ultraman. The poses, the movement, every action behind the show added up to something that inspired Anno for the rest of his career. As a young adult enrolled at Osaka University of Arts, Anno would make an Ultraman fan film, showing his passion for the Red Giant through the simplest means necessary. There was no miniature set, the special effects were rudimentary, and there were no suits. And yet, this film showed off the essentials of what Ultraman was. The poses, the movement, evoking a sense of nostalgia to what Ultraman was about. He was so passionate that when the audience laughed, seeing this film as a lighthearted parody, he stormed out of the premiere screening. He wanted to invoke the same drama he saw the original Ultraman as. This was the passion that took Anno towards working on his craft. Though he enrolled at Osaka to pursue animation, he realized that developing his films with his group Daikon Film was a better use of his time than the assignments he was given. One of the first major works it developed, as well as their namesake, was Daikon 3, an opening animation for the Nihon SF convention of the same name held in Osaka. There were many times where he recontextualizes animations of cars smashing or guns firing into what he turned in. But people didn't look to his college as a reason to hire him. They saw his group's Daikon 3 animation, which led him to work at Studio Nue to animate shows such as Macross. He soon stopped paying his tuition, and he was eventually expelled. He revisited Ultraman in the 1983 film, Return of Ultraman. Anno wrote a multi-layered story that includes the attack squad's captain weighing his options against the monster after his son is caught in the crossfire, the use of nuclear weapons to solve the situation, and the hero being punished for going against it. The miniature work, special effects, and monster design are superb, as done by the incredible team at Daikon Film. Yet again, Ultraman was played by Hideaki Anno. Basically unchanged from his last appearance, this Ultraman is just Anno in a jacket with a color timer. He still wasn't making proper Ultraman. He would get there in due time. It just takes passion and a dream. Daikon Film followed Return of Ultraman up with a sequel to Daikon 3. The team worked long, tumultuous hours during the summer heat of 1983, animating Daikon 4 for the Nihon SF convention that same year. It's set to Twilight by Electric Light Orchestra, and I don't really have to introduce it. You've probably seen it before. But it's an immaculate work of art that feels like the definition of pop culture. At the same time, Topcraft needed animators for Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. They put out adverts in Animage, the magazine that was putting out Hayao Miyazaki's original manga. Anno took a chance, and alongside a couple of friends, he moved to Tokyo, putting his entire future on the line to get the job. His drawings and flipbook animations caught the attention of Miyazaki, and he was hired on the spot, being the key animator for the Giant God Warriors. These beings were the cause of the 7 Days of Fire in the world of Nausicaa, a reset of society and humanity as a whole, a sequence that asks the question, what can humanity really do in the scope of the universe? The answer? Nothing. This job proved to be instrumental to Anno's career. He followed it with familiar territory with the film version of Macross, Do You Remember Love, and soon worked on a sprawl of anime created by mangaka he looked up to, such as Urusei Yatsura. But still, he found the most help from his friends. He met Shinji Higuchi through a mutual connection, who would later do the special effects for Daikan's Yamata no Orochi no Gyakushu. They had a mutual love for tokusatsu, of which Higuchi was already involved in at greater scale. Higuchi. At a young age, Shinji Higuchi got hands-on experience with the art of tokusatsu, from visiting Toho Studios through an aunt who worked for them. Scale is one of the most important aspects in kaiju tokusatsu, and Higuchi understands that well. There is a weight behind these characters that the works involving Eiji Tsuburaya invoked, especially in the original Ultraman. There are many techniques that Tsuburaya used as a director of special effects that have stood the test of times in their own ways. Sure, it's not like these techniques are completely realistic, but they're involved. They show a sense of care and attention that is still taken very seriously in the Ultra franchise of today, even with modern sensibilities in mind. These works were never meant to be real. They were meant to be interesting. They were meant to be good. This is where the fantasy element of Ultraman comes from. The sincerity of the products creates faith from the viewers for it. Belief in fantasy is the getaway to enjoying the universe of monsters, aliens, good and evil forces, and how the world reacts to them. Really, Shinji Higuchi, the director of Shin Ultraman and co-director for Shin Godzilla, has a pretty big responsibility here in trying to continue that philosophy. So, how does he do it? Exceptionally well. Though we may be getting ahead of ourselves. Anno's love for Ultraman can be easily explained, but Higuchi's love, appropriately enough, is in the aspects behind the camera. Higuchi once saw Anno's Return of Ultraman, believed it to be even better than Ultraman 80, and decided to seek out Daikon Film to join them as an SFX expert. That's where Higuchi and Anno's friendship started, although they wouldn't have a direct collaboration until years later. Higuchi was credited as an assistant modeler for Godzilla 1984, but had his first really important role in tokusatsu in Daikon's Yamata no Orochi no Gyakushu, translated as The Eight-Headed Serpent's Counterattack. Directing the special effects just as Tsuburaya did a couple decades earlier. They're really something to behold. There's a real timeline going on between techniques shown in the Tsuburaya-directed films and television shows and this film. It's something that continues to persist in projects he's involved in, such as special effects for the Heisei Gamera trilogy, as well as his directed films like in The Sinking of Japan, another name for the 2006 film adaptation of Japan Sinks and the Attack on Titan duology. But before all that, he joined Daikon Film, just before it became Gainax, to create anime that, ultimately, made an impact on pop culture, let alone the culture of its medium. Higuchi was given assistant directing duties with Hiroyuki Yamaga on Gainax's first feature film, Royal Space Force: The Wings of Oniomis. He was mostly responsible for the world building in the film, both contextually and artistically, streamlining the collaboration of so many talents in the Gainax team to create a truly rich story. You could call it retrofuturism, but that would imply that there's familiarity with how the technology of the world evolved. It's like the 1950s and the kind of war that was fought during the decade, but different. And in that way, it makes the film much more immersive. It's Higuchi's sense of scale that definitely shows here, and if you like Hideaki Anno's animations of vehicles, explosions, and weapons, this film shows those off, and then some. Buddy. Though Royal Space Force did not gross its own budget back, it did sprout the close collaboration between Higuchi and Anno, as well as that from Shoichi Masuo, an effects animator and director whose contributions to their work are foundational. He's responsible for many examples of firepower in every Evangelion movie. His credits not only include that, but also Giant Robo, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and the first 9 Pokemon movies. If these films cemented what many Pokemon moves look like to you, well, that's thanks to Masuo. He followed Anno and Higuchi inside and out of Gainax, and though he passed in 2017, his philosophies were still followed in Evangelion 3.0 plus 1.0, as well as the Shin series. Anno and Higuchi went on to work on Top Wo Nerai, known internationally as Gunbuster, an example of the duo showing how humanity can fight their battles in the universe, accentuated by the personal struggles of two pilots of the Gunbuster itself. Though, once again, very beneficial for the two creatively, this was at the peak of Anno being overworked, as he also directed Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water at the same time. After this extensive workload, Anno found himself trying and failing to prop up more projects. This would influence his emotional outlook in Gainax's next big project, Neon Genesis Evangelion. In tribute to his friend, he named the protagonist Shinji after Shinji Higuchi. Shinji Ikari was the sort of character that Anno wrote as a vehicle for his own struggles creatively, albeit with that same collaboration to bring the character out from the rest of the Gainax team. Shinji being named after Higuchi sounds cute from the perspective of their friendship, albeit a little interesting, given what Shinji faces in the show and in the end of Evangelion. What can Anno do in the scope of his whole life being on his shoulders, or in the context of the show? What can humanity really do in the scope of the universe? Fight back. And lose. And yet, hope persists. Humanity insists. In a way, these questions link back to the theme of Henshin heroes, whether it's through the creation by the hands of evil, the irony of saving those who may not know it, or being so insignificant to a bigger picture, there is always one thing that will stand. Hope. So, the duo kept going. They each branched off from Gainax to find themselves working as fully fledged live-action film directors. Anno had support from friends totally outside of the anime world, most notably from Shunji Iwai. This depicted a gradual change in Anno's work in general, as his skills in directing for anime were waning, though he made enough friends and collaborators who can understand his ethic and work with him, not around him. He became much more difficult in the production of projects he was involved in. He stepped down from Gainax's Karekano project due to troubles around TV Tokyo's boundaries on what to air. That's a topic in itself, to say the least. He later created Cutie Honey in 2004, an adaptation of Go Nagai's manga and anime of the same name, and the references to tokusatsu are all over the place in this movie. At the same time as the production of Evangelion, Shinji Higuchi was the director of SFX for the Gamera trilogy. These films put Gamera back in the spotlight at a time where Godzilla already had plenty of films released in theaters in the Heisei period. As the Showa era of Gamera ended the way it did, resulting in a cheap compilation film, this was extremely validating. Once again, Godzilla wasn't the only giant monster in Japanese theaters anymore, and much of that was owed to Higuchi's work. The two returned to work together on the Shin Evangelion movies, starting from 1.0 in 2007 all the way to 3.0 plus 1.0 in 2021. Around the same time as 3.0's production, Anno revisited the giant god warriors from Nausicaa in a film directed by Higuchi. Kyoshine Tokyo ni Arawaru. Giant god warrior appears in Tokyo. The warrior returns to enact indiscriminate destruction upon the city, to act as an anti-genesis of human creation. Though it leads into Nausicaa depicting how the 7 days of fire started, it works on its own merits not only about the interesting physical antithesis to the development of technology, industry, and commercialism, but rather, this is a legitimization of tokusatsu as a whole. These are the techniques we can perform on film. It takes us to places we'd never thought possible. Themes across the entire short film, whether it's emotional or in the construction of the work, would reappear in Shin Godzilla. Anno was approached by Toho to pen Shin Godzilla soon after Evangelion's 3.0's run in theaters, but because he suffered another depression from working on the film, an ongoing trend of Anno's relationship with developing the franchise, he lacked the confidence to take up the offer. It was only after Higuchi encouraged him to take it on. With the insistence that he will take half of the directing duties, Anno stepped up and brought out a film that reinvigorates the core ideas of what Godzilla was all about. It came at yet another time that Japan was going through a crisis. As people suffered through tragedies through the Fukushima nuclear disaster and Tohoku earthquake, there was an emotional weight put on the film, and it knew how to portray it. People are shown in the film observing Godzilla ravage through Japan, a disaster that its people cannot live with. This being a direct equivalent to the original 1954 Godzilla, and its representation of the horrific events Japan went through during and after World War II as a whole. Godzilla also works as a representation of agony and cynicism of the bureaucracy of Japan, which is shown as being too slow and methodical to appropriately react to the disaster. Shin Godzilla is a story that not many people will gravitate towards, especially in the United States. Though it received an incredibly positive reception there, it can be argued that the context of the film's narrative, and how it ties to the history of Japan, simply can't be translated. At the end of the film, it said how the nuclear fallout by Godzilla is minimal, its half-life being incredibly short, and that Japan can focus on rebuilding. While there's a spectacle in seeing Godzilla fight another monster, he also serves as a warning for the dangers we can put ourselves in, and also the dangers we can't fight back against. That's why it's up to us, humans, to try what we can to keep prospering. Not only was the story reborn for modern audiences, but it was also an evolution for its tokusatsu roots. Initially, Godzilla was meant to be portrayed by a physical animatronic, but Toho opted for him to be completely CGI. Underneath the CGI of Godzilla is still a suit actor, acting a part equivalent to your Haruo Nakajima in the Showa era. There's just as much skill, attention, and care put into this as the old rubber suits and miniature works. It's just a different form factor now. Though coming out at a time where the MonsterVerse was up and running, Shin Godzilla was a monumental success, winning Picture of the Year at the Japan Academy Film Prize in 2017, and taking home many other awards. It was a success that would pave the way for much more, even beyond our galaxy. Birth of Shin Ultraman. A monster rains havoc on Earth. A defense team is dispatched, but their firepower isn't enough. Then, a silver giant appears, with the strength and abilities to defend the Earth. That's the surface of Ultraman, and certainly what the general consensus is. But Ultraman is a production. It's a labor of love that persists in people's faith in it. There's a drama, a sense of scale, and the feeling that, despite everything, there will always be a light. Ultraman has been able to deliver stories in new ways, even now. This series revisits monsters and aliens as if they're old friends, and there's a degree of respect to the old works in the mainline Ultra series. It's a legacy that can't be ignored. As Ultraman passed its 50-year anniversary, Tsuburaya Productions knew it was time for a reimagining of the original giant who started it all, with a projected release date for 2016. Hideaki Anno, at this point, was already intricately writing a script treatment for Return of Ultraman, inspired by his original fan film. Anno submitted the treatment to Tsuburaya, and despite the company approaching him a few times before this, he quickly abandoned the script. And of course, many aspects would change from its initial draft to what we see on screen. There's not much known about it. Tsuburaya's initial plans for their 50th anniversary film fell through, and the production staff shifted to accompany what can be done for this Ultraman reboot. President Takayuki Tsukagoshi approached Anno again, with a proposal of writing a whole trilogy of Ultraman films. But due to Anno not having confidence in a third film down the line, he gave documents writing out the plans for 2 films, with the first being a self-contained story, and the second being Return of Ultraman. He aimed to depict an Ultraman story that, like Shin Godzilla, is to show the worldview of Japanese people today and how they would react to a real-life Ultraman. He wanted to depict the anxieties, the paranoia, and the militancy of the world's reaction. The world probably would like to weaponize him, but humanity would feel differently about Ultraman. At the heart of the original show was the ingenuity of hard work and talent from people who sincerely wanted to make a worthwhile program. Its original subtitle was Kuso Tokusatsu Series, or a special effects fantasy series. So it became Anno's mission to create a work that would appeal to the adults who saw Ultraman in their childhoods, and one that could depict the fantasies that only Tokusatsu could achieve. There was a lot on Anno's shoulders, as he was juggling projects during the pre-production phase, mostly on Evangelion 3.0 plus 1.0. The directing job would be taken by Higuchi, though Anno would have time to help during post-production, such as editing, CG, and motion capture work, after film wrapped. The original plans for Shin Ultraman 2 is indicated that Anno himself would take over as director, however. Higuchi was honored to have this much of a force in bringing this project to fruition, and also gave a sense of importance to his role. With all of these factors in place, we can now enter a fantasy built by special effects. Ultra question. Anyone who knows about the Ultra series would immediately pick up on what this is alluding to. What comes next is the ultimate homage to the start of it all, Ultra Q. Early Ultra shows had strange and surreal title cards, with Ultra Q and Ultraman 1966, starting with Swirling Pain revealing their name. Although Ultramans would show the Ultra Q name at first, but reveal its own title afterwards. Shin Ultraman would follow this by showing the previous project's name, Shin Godzilla, and blasting in with its own title. More credibility to this film being a sequel, if only spiritually. And then... Oh, I'm sorry. I must have put on Shin Godzilla by mistake. Actually, this is another reference to Ultra Q. Eiji Tsubadai's connection to the Godzilla franchise allowed his company to use old kaiju suits, and the original Gomez was just a retooled Godzilla. As another homage to the original, Shin Gomez here is a rework of Shin Godzilla's model. The rest of the kaiju are direct references to past encounters in Ultra Q. Though in the old show, the story revolved around reporters focused on the mystery surrounding the kaiju, rather than on face-to-face confrontations. Episodes depicted the spectacle of these fantasies, rather than these fantasies being solved. If I could be a little anecdotal here, my mind was blown the first time I saw this opening sequence, which was made available officially as a kind of teaser for American fans. I really couldn't contain my excitement, not only seeing old monsters on the big screen, but seeing it all recreated with modern technology and in high definition. Yeah, that's something I personally like adding into the conversation. How far technology has come since the beginning. Just watching these shots between Ultra Q and Shin Ultraman is phenomenal. You can really see the love and care crafted into every frame to create a beautiful motion picture. Here we see the military take down these monsters, some being defeated both conventionally and unconventionally, and some monsters even mysteriously leave Japan altogether. This all adds up to this world to call for countermeasures. A group is tasked as being the ultimate response for the kaiju phenomenon. Despite sharing the same English acronym, Shin Ultraman's version of the titular defense team differs from its own namesake in the original show. Instead of the Science Special Search Party, we're now introduced to the S-Class Species Suppression Protocol, a group of electric specialists that come up with a plan of dealing with kaiju. In a similar vein to Yaguchi's ragtag team from Shin Godzilla, everyone in the Triple SP is more on the eccentric side. Our lead is Shinji Kaminaga, played by Takumi Saito, and he's someone we don't actually see much of. What we do know is that he's an expert strategist, but he's still willing to put himself at risk for innocence. For most of the film, Saito is actually playing Ultraman in control of Kaminaga's body. An interesting reversal of the typical ultra-human relationship. The role of Kaminaga was one of the earlier casting decisions, with Takumi Saito being first cast in Shin Godzilla beforehand. Like many in his generation, he caught reruns of the classic Ultraman series on television, but his connection to the franchise runs deeper than that. His father had previously worked on pyrotechnics for Ultraman Taro, and he actually met famed Ultraman Artur Akioji Soji for the film Zura Deka, localized in the West as the Rug Cop. Yet again, the lead protagonist for an Anno-written show is named Shinji, although here, I feel there's more to be said about the etymology of the name rather than the context of Higuchi. Shinji Ikari's name can't really be compared here either, as his is written in katakana. Shinji Kaminaga's first name contains a kanji for Shin, meaning new, and the kanon pronunciation of Ni, meaning two. Likewise, his family name is Kaminaga, which reads as Eternal God. Akihisa Taki and Yumi Funaberi, played by Daiki Arioka and Akari Hayami, respectively, are the two nerds of the group. Taki is a mathematician, physicist, and nerd who brings his interest to his work, as evident by the numerous Thunderbirds, Mighty Jack, and Star Trek models on his desk. Sounds familiar. Funaberi is a prepper biologist who looks at the biological root of S-Class kaijus, rather than resorting to firepower. It's implied in the film, but extra material explains that she was the one who came up with the way to defeat Pegula from the opening. Both Hayami and Arioka went into the role being more anxious than excited, and Arioka in particular believed he simply wasn't as experienced for the film compared to his fellow cast members. And it's easy to see why, as the captain of the team, Kimio Tamura, is played by Hidetoshi Nishijima. The captain is an ardent yet trustful member of the group who takes the initiative in anti-kaiju operations, though he always sees the group as equals. Toku fans will recognize him as Kotaro Minami in the series Kamen Rider Black Sun. But this film precedes that in being what Nishijima worked on right after the critically acclaimed and Academy Award-winning film, Drive My Car. This casting is important, not just because of how good Nishijima is as an actor, but for the legitimacy it brings to the tokusatsu medium. I know, to those in the know, tokusatsu is an important thing. It ties back to the history of cinema in ways beyond just Godzilla. Of course, Shin Godzilla was loved by critics around the world, but that came with the precedent of the original film before it. It's harder to sell people on the concept of Ultraman, despite the franchising of Western heroes being more prevalent than it has seen before. You and I may be familiar with Ultraman, and so we have no problem with watching this sort of film. But for an audience that needs a reason to make themselves open to the concept, Nishijima is probably your best choice. So, to bring the nuance of actors of this magnitude makes all the difference. The team here is an ensemble cast. Each member brings enough to the table. And this is just the main team, as even side characters and upcoming aliens have recognizable faces too. Yutaka Takenouchi joins Takumi Saito as being another actor to jump from Shin Godzilla to Shin Ultraman. But unlike Saito, his role seems to be the same one. A recurring character, this secretary who has a line to the Prime Minister is said to be Prime Minister Aide Akasaka from Shin Godzilla in interviews with Anno. However, this is fairly unofficial. There was major back and forth between Tsuburaya and Toho. And to avoid setbacks with the uses of Shin Godzilla, Higuchi and Anno hint at a subtext of continuity, such as Takenouchi's involvement and the opening swirl. There's continuity if you want, but the emotional lineage between Evangelion, Shin Godzilla, and this film seems to be more important. Monster. Like Shin Godzilla, there's an emphasis on the nuclear impact of the monsters. Neronga is the first case shown on screen rather than in passing, a monster that feasts on energy. Once the JSDF shuts down the energy being transferred from a power plant to Neronga, the beast goes towards residential areas to attack. The design for Neronga harkens back to Toru Narita's original drawings for the monster, while also giving tribute to its original suit that was a retool of Baragon's suit, one of many retools that would appear in the original Ultraman. I think they were trying to manage both aspects of the character by retaining the front view of the suit's face, while emphasizing the yellow spines of the original drawings. The production opted for authenticity in every place they could, so the motion capture suit for Neronga was Neronga. Yeah, it's just the suit they've been using since Ultraman Rube. It helped the motion capture team for how the suit moves in the shows, which they were aiming to do, rather than capture a realistic movement for the character, to work in the fantasy element ways that looks cool. The aspect of Baragon's suit being reused from multiple kaiju in Ultraman was observed, and was referenced through Gabara being based off Neronga. Neronga's suit, this time, was given a cone to recreate the general silhouette of the original Gabara, as well as help animators in motion capture. To drive the point even further, the returning kaiju Pagos, who was also a Baragon reuse, is depicted with the head of Gabara and the body of Neronga. Once again, Gabara takes notes of Narita's original drawings, and has a wider emphasis on the creature's trill/cone. We'll get more into his role when it comes. And then, our hero appears. From the stars, Ultraman appears at the same time that Kaminaga tries to save a child from the monster. His motion capture was actually played by Hideaki Anno. Consider this the creator's cameo, and also consider that this is something he wanted to do for years. Let him have it. As a tribute to the original Type A mask that Ultraman used for the first 13 episodes, his face here is slightly wrinkled and shaped differently. Interesting to note, he is also gray and silver. Instead of posing heroically to fend off Neronga's electricity like the original show, the giant simply stands there. Then, he shoots his Spacium beam. It looks just like the original show's Spacium effect with some added flair. And that's no coincidence. It was actually the handiwork of classic optical effects animator Sadao Rizuka. He's responsible for many optical effects throughout the history of tokusatsu. The original Kamen Rider henshins, Godzilla's atomic breath, many Sentai seasons, and relevant here, the original Ultraman beam effects. He's done them all, but he ultimately went uncredited for his work there. I'm glad we're able to recognize his work now. And so, Ultraman flies off, and mysteriously, Kaminaga walks completely unscathed from being in the crossfire of Ultraman's arrival. Person. Ultraman here is decidedly minimalist to take on the classic red and silver giant, as in, he compromises 2 colors, 3 if counting his illuminated eyes. The color timer, which original designer Toru Narita famously hated, was removed completely to embrace his original designs. Initial sketches included veiny muscular parts to represent Ultraman's red patterns, the original intentions for the suit, as well as the ones that we see again in Ultraman the Next designs. Narita didn't want this to be the main focal point for his design, however. He saw Ultraman as an embodiment of the cosmos, with a stature and presence that looked initially simple, like space itself, but with red accents to symbolize Mars, as opposed to Earth's blue. This was a design he held dearly and revisited it several times throughout his life, including a painting in 1983 entitled The Incarnation of Truth, Justice, and Beauty. Hideaki Anno saw this painting and was struck on an artistic and emotional level. He asked himself, how do I portray this beauty on screen? By doing it exactly the way Narita wanted. He believed that the design for an Ultraman for the Reiwa era was already made, an all-time classic design that would only get better with advancements in technology. As this was a completely CG Ultraman, the team was able to keep philosophies that Narita wanted, so aspects in the in-show suit were kept off. The mask was made from original molds that Akira Sasaki created under Narita's supervision, and they didn't need to include peepholes under the eyes. These changes, despite seemingly minor, were major points of contention that Narita had with Tsuburaya Productions when the first Ultraman series was in production, and that 1983 painting was an expression of what he really wanted. One other change made to respect Narita's design was the mocap actors not needing a zipper to put on the suit. And despite all of this, what was still kept was Bin Furuya's physique. Incredibly, Furuya returned to reprise his role as Ultraman through motion capture, and the model was built from his stature from the very start. He didn't do the action scenes, which is completely understandable, but the fact that the team brought him on board is probably the most authentic thing you could apply. The original Ultraman film that Anno made stood on how well the actor's movements fit Ultraman, and so Shin Ultraman himself was finalized. A model of him was the very first thing from the project that people saw, and reactions were a little mixed. You probably saw this picture being memed everywhere, but really, it's a great encapsulation of what this character is about. He doesn't fit in this world, yet he's there. He's an alien, and this is the most alien he can be. The most important aspect to him is the fact that he is completely for the benefit of humanity. That's something that comes up a lot in previous entries of Ultraman, but it's done here with more weight than before. There's something particularly interesting in the way that Ultraman notices, out of everything that is so small to him, that Kaminaga saved somebody. That became his main goal in the film as well, to learn how he can become like that. A new member joins the crew, Hiroko Asami, played by Masami Nagasawa. She's a spry, attentive analyst who's assigned as Kaminaga's partner, someone she immediately questions on his role as a human. Suddenly, Gabara appears, and heads straight to a nuclear waste facility to feast on. The look for Gabara emphasizes his armor plates from the Narita sketches. The emphasis on Gabara's cone may come from Gabara's appearance in Ultraman the Ultimate Hero, wherein Higuchi was a sculptor on the kaiju suits. Higuchi mentioned in interviews how much of a pain it was to work with it, however emphasizing with the original show's crew and how they handled Gabara. The team is dispatched, but not before the US military intervenes to drop munitions off on the monster.
米軍からの請求者はうちではなく防衛省に回すように。
Kaminaga makes a swift getaway, using a beta capsule to turn into Ultraman. What's also awesome is that the sphere that the capsule houses is Ultraman's own travel sphere, or a dimension utilizing the gravity-bending Planck brain to house Ultraman's true form, which we'll get to. Here, Ultraman sports his classic silver and red colors, but untraditionally, he utilizes the Ultra V barrier to block Gabara's nuclear fire. It's a move that's typically used by Ultraman Jack in his original show. Suddenly, Ultraman breaks off the move to absorb Gabara's blast itself. His red colors drain to green, which is an incredibly deep cut. It's a reference to how magazines around Return of Ultraman's airing would show off the people of M78, who were Jack except decked out in green. Ultraman takes off with Gabara's body, seemingly knowing how bad the nuclear fallout was from defeating Pagos, which is a tongue-in-cheek reference to how similar the plots of Pagos and Gabara's original episodes were, let alone them featuring a Baragon reuse. With these times that Ultraman is exposed to the world, it's soon seen by more visitors, who attempted to use the sanctity of the Earth for their own gain. Spacemen. Although the first act of Shin Ultraman depicts many monsters, most of which are from Ultra Q, the story follows the aliens of the original Ultraman much more, which is an element that Ultra 7 emphasized. Although, I understand why they made that sort of decision. Having beings who can communicate with the human characters of the story drives the plot along much faster. Zara reappears, with the plan to enrapture Earth for its resources, essentially being an extension of the original Zara's plan. He immediately seizes the information of Ultraman's identity, creating realistic depictions of Kaminaga transforming into Ultraman. He then starts communication with the Triple SP, explaining that he just so happens to land in Japan, coinciding with the kaijus and Ultraman appearing. Immediately, he sets up talks with the government, with a direct line to the Prime Minister, just so he can turn this information around to governments around the world so they can cannibalize themselves. Despite Zarab trying to ruin the Earth's trust in Ultraman by impersonating him, a very good one at that, aside from the eyes, he comes back and slices Zarab with a dismembering halo. One thing to point out here is that out of all the action scenes in Shin Ultraman, the fight with Zarab is the closest to its original counterpart, right down to some of the choreography being a 1-to-1 match. While most of Ultraman's movements in this film were animated through mocap, this fight scene started out as an animated reconstruction of the first Zarab fight. Even minute details like Furuya actually recoiling in pain from hitting his hand were recreated. Once their fight takes to the sky, the scene instead takes cues from the very first Baltan fight with the same music. Zarab's look here, once again, takes inspiration from Toru Narita's design, emphasizing for his physical features to only be seen from his front. Early concepts of the film took this a step further by visualizing Zarab as a see-through alien. The final design shows Zarab having a surface at his front, but the other half of his body is transparent. The control of information and how people find out is a topic that Shin Godzilla addressed as well. In Shin Godzilla, social media and the internet at large were framed as a means of the people getting updated on natural disasters in a way that the government couldn't keep up with, even when they try to cover it up. Shin Ultraman takes a decidedly more critical angle, showing how malicious parties can spread disinformation or sensitive info on a whim. This is exemplified even further with the arrival of Mephilas, who showcases Ultraman's beta system technology to humanity by enlarging Asami and having her walk throughout the city, much like Mephilas showing off his powers in his original debut episode. Given she's someone who works in intelligence, Asami is distraught to find that videos of her has spread all over the internet, with some even having pretty inappropriate comments attached to them. Asami swears revenge against Mephilas, and is immediately sent a message on her laptop apologizing for his actions, promptly followed by all posts about her being deleted. While comical, this is just one small action done in favor of his ulterior motive. Interestingly, the government buys into negotiations of Zarab and Mephilas almost immediately, and they respond to the needs of these individuals rather than the presence of Ultraman, who represents a whole collective. Zarab is possibly very successful in other parts in his mission, as his reveal of Kaminaga being Ultraman sent shockwaves to the government, making them distrust the Triple SP and in pursuit of Ultraman. And to these aliens, humanity is looked down upon as a pest on the planet that could be useful, a tool to use against the whole of the universe, or a danger upon the universe if they survive. The Triple SP recognize these motivations along with Ultraman, and they seem to run away from the constant bureaucracy and steps it takes to protect humanity, the likes of which we've seen in Shin Godzilla. Compared to that movie, I don't think it's a coincidence that the numerous government titles and names of cabinet members shown there, which were used to satirize tabloids and naming of figureheads during critical events, are rarely shown here. It's a technique that's being done to try to show humanity can progress without pausing to consider things like budgets, or setbacks, or the need to focus on the pride of the government and its many weapons. Likewise, there's little to no focus on the weapons here compared to Shin Godzilla. Sure, it explains a component of Ultraman's energy, being the atomic substance Spacium-133, but it's shown on a metaphysical yet mathematical level. Some critics argued that in Shin Godzilla, the focus on the military was meant to support them, rather than considering the little impact they have in comparison to the rationalization of defeating the monster. Anno and Higuchi probably took this to heart, as the monsters and aliens here are shown as practical problems with practical answers. I think it's incredibly telling when Ultraman is shown to avoid using a Spacium energy to defeat Gabara. His nuclear impact is something that he understands to be wary of. It's the constant subtext of weaponization and warfare being beyond the grasp of people with that power, and any use of its transgression of humanity. Mephilas recognizes humanity as a key to gain more power. Asami was just the first example of Mephilas using the beta box to weaponize all people living on Earth, and he declares Kaminaga to be a success, being the first fusion of a human. Ultraman himself is a tool. While Zato's power of doctoring footage based on truth shortly worked, his motivation is to stop humanity from progressing any further. He comes from the perspective of cowardice, but there's a particular kind of horror to Mephilas, who essentially agrees that these are the people who can become harmful. His idea differs in the way that he wants to take control of that harm. He exclaims that he loves the human race while talking to Kaminaga, and that the planet of light knows what he is doing. Are you an alien or a human? Mephilas is one of the few in the film to have an incredibly different design than what Toru Narita envisioned. His human form is played by Koji Yamamoto, who first appeared in Tokusatsu as Soryo-Hiden in Kamen Rider 01. It's interesting to think that he most likely acted in 01 and Shin Ultraman back-to-back in the same time frame, but as concept art reveals, this role probably wasn't meant to have a human form to begin with. There are many sketches of Mephilas wearing a suit. This happens to look very similar to the alien who released Zeton in the original Ultraman. Anyway, this film was produced in cooperation with the Japan Self-Defense Forces. They do have a policy regarding their cooperation, being that the film can't be critical of the JSDF. But this film seems to have leeway in regarding how they depict the army, as well as the government. It's a little more critical than Shin Godzilla, which was already built around how a free world can still be suffocating to live in, and slow to take action. Godzilla wasn't just a walking rhetorical device that alludes to disasters. He was written to also be the human mind that's gone through the trauma of waking life. In Evangelion, Shinji's key to becoming an individual and achieving personhood was from understanding that depression is a part of life. Trauma is prevalent in many ways, and Godzilla is the epicenter of that subtext. It would keep festering, evolving, and hurting those around him. Godzilla, like the 1954 original film, is a product of humanity. It's the result of some sort of existing deep-sea creature that evolved from the nuclear waste dumped in the Pacific Ocean by the United States. The one person who knew about Godzilla and its eventual rise onto the main island is a scientist named Goromaki. Like the character of Serizawa before him, it's his research that leads Japan to stopping the creature's evolutionary process, which would keep going as long as it acquires water and oxygen. The very last shot of Shin Godzilla is the frozen remains of the creature's last form, human-like figures, all nearly breaking away from its source. So, what does this all add up to in Shin Ultraman? It's the culmination of the will to keep going, and how it requires understanding a human's actions, no matter if it's good or bad, impulsive or premeditated. Anything that stands in the way of humanity prospering, whether it's a natural disaster, a weapon, or a monster, it should always be considered a transgression. The main impetus of Ultraman is him trying to understand why Kaminaga sacrificed himself for one life. And here, he understands that human life is important, not in the body's use in war, but for the body's unselfish need to help one another. Kaminaga may not be the one speaking throughout most of the film, but his will is ever present in influencing Ultraman. Through communicating with Mephilas, who makes his intentions clear, Ultraman makes a decision for humanity. Mephilas is revealed to be the one who kickstarted many kaiju's awakenings, and he had directly controlled Pagos, Naranga, and Gabra from the same biological framework. And now, Ultraman wants to stop Mephilas from turning humans into weapons. Quick aside, this Mephilas would work extremely well as an antagonist for a whole film, and he almost was. This fight becomes close, and though the one with the beta box is in the Triple SP's hands thanks to swift actions by Ultraman, his power becomes weaker. His reserves of Spacium-133 is dwindling thanks to this fusion of Kaminaga, and at the very last edge, Mephilas sees someone in the distance. He realizes now that his work on humanity is done. Lipiah. The most important aspect of Higuchi and Anno was that they were recreating Ultraman. And it's not just in the literal sense. They wanted to release a new Ultraman to a new audience, yet keep the same feelings of the original. In 1966, the human character who becomes Ultraman was named after Takuchi Hayata, another Japanese Olympian who strived to become Ultra C, or beyond level C of gymnasts. As it fit with the time, the team decided that this was an aspect that could be left off from this new Ultraman in order to have something that works with the meaning of the text. Kaminaga Shinji, the next eternal god. It's interpretive, but that's one way you can look at it. One of the more major changes to the original Ultraman character was the removal of his voice. The original was done by Masao Nakasone, and has become one of the most iconic parts of the franchise, let alone of the character. It's a pretty radical thing to do when portraying Ultraman's fights. His voice almost seems integral to the whole thing. The fact that it's not here isn't entirely bad, and they already have the original Ultraman's presence by having Ben Furuya return as a suit actor. Ultraman may not grunt in the traditional sense, but as it turns out, he's not entirely without a voice of his own. Issei Takahashi, a longtime J-drama actor and singer, was brought on to provide Ultraman's speaking voice, as he is yet another friend of Anno and Higuchi. So, you have a pretty silent Ultraman for the majority of the film. He does express himself through Kaminaga, but the character himself is one who acts completely physically. There may be a void left in his classic grunts being cut, but you can make the argument that it's filled in through other ways. If you watched Chainsaw Man or heard any popular Vocaloid track, you've most likely heard songs by Kenshi Yonezu before. His music is intricate, verbose, loud, and gently crafted. Yonezu's work is a blend of a multitude of his interests, such as the words of Kenji Miyazawa's Night on the Galactic Railroad, and the sound of Susumu Hirasawa's Mother. He may be one of a few Vocaloid producers to break through in Japan's modern music scene, but he's one of the most unique, as he developed his style through interest in postmodern soundscapes and pop melody sensibilities. And the song he created for Shin Ultraman, M87, is a sincere and optimistic ballad of a broken soul that learns to rebuild their strength, with an unknown yet experienced figure being an eternal guide for them. When you combine this with the context of the film, could it be a representation of Kaminaga, Japan, or the Earth itself? Are we the ones who are lost, with us not recognizing our own reflections? Or is that Ultraman himself? One aspect that makes his grand return is the soundtrack composed by Kunio Miyauchi. I'd say half the tracks featured are the original recordings, and the other half is newly arranged by Shido Sagasu, a composer whose work you've most likely heard even outside of Anno's collaborations with him. Sagasu's discography encompasses a deep knowledge of jazz and orchestra, owing to the fact that he had experience as a member of the legendary jazz fusion band T-Square. Though he started composing for anime in 1984, he began collaborating with Hideaki Anno and Gainax on Nadia, Secret of the Blue Water in 1990. Tracks featured in its soundtrack are optimistic and adventurous, showing how comfortable his style is with Anno's direction, and Shin Ultraman isn't his first work in tokusatsu either. There's his work on Shin Godzilla, of course, which too rearranges original music cues across the Godzilla franchise, as well as from Sagasu's playbook. He also composed for the live-action Casshern movie, which is a unique mix of foreboding, desolate, and mechanical. Though he hasn't worked on the Ultra series beforehand, he did work on SSS Gridman and its sequel, Dynazenon, which shows Sagasu's experimentation and dabbling in the genres of EDM at times, and yet still giving both entries the empowering scale shown in live-action tokusatsu. He was also on Higuchi's Attack on Titan films, portraying the Titan's scale and weight in appropriately booming choirs and brass sections. His music weaves between the calm and energetic moments of the works he's involved in. Pianos can be heard for those somber moments, or even when the situations are tense and paranoid. Brass sections show up during times between high-stakes events, either in anticipation for them, or for the need to escape from it, and the drums settle you into those impactful moments. It feels militaristic. Evangelion's score is striking in this regard. The most visceral moments are accentuated by Sagasu's music. In such a way, the tone of those moments is lost without it. The emotional climaxes to Evangelion are brutal, traumatizing, and yet empowering, and Sagasu works those moments to his advantage. Decisive Battle, the track that first appeared in Evangelion, is iconic in its own right. Despite the incredibly energetic pace, there's still a whimsical tone being displayed, especially in the string section. It's understandable why Sagasu revisits this piece again and again throughout his career, such as in Shin Godzilla, because that's what Sagasu's style ultimately is, whimsical in the midst of overpowering excitement. That's exactly what this Ultraman needs. The music featured in Ultraman has been one of the most important aspects historically. Sagasu, at this point in time, is an experienced composer who knows how to give a voice to the world that Ultraman inhabits. In the Miyauchi composed pieces that Sagasu arranged, he manages to show off something new with these songs. The track, M5, which appears most prominently in the Zadab fight, is a whole new perspective on a classic. Minor sensibilities are at play, such as the lead guitar that is on, as well as the string section that complements the main melody, a signature of Evangelion's score. The piece, Early Morning from Tokyo, from Shin Godzilla, returns, this time as a slightly faster, cheerier, Early Morning from London. The London in the name is most likely a reference towards the soundtrack being recorded and arranged with the London Symphony Orchestra. And then there's the sound design, which is effective and subtly provocative. Once again, there's a unique mix of the old effects and new choices. There are plenty of quiet moments, with natural sounds of the forest suiting where Kaminaga is looking over Kaminaga. Then there are the sounds of the aliens, with Zadab's high-pitched, droning ambience settling in for his conversation with all he talks to. And it's especially tense when he talks directly to Kaminaga. There's a more pleasant, yet foreboding version of this that plays during his talks with Zoffy, but when the more mechanical sounds are used, they're even scarier. The weapons themselves are brutal and made to sound heavy. They could range from what we know, or what we don't know. It's terrifying. You know that it's developing, and it's all turning into a force of unspeakable power that's made to undo all existence that we know of personally. And, like Shin Godzilla, the vocalized songs make a huge impact, with lyrics that drive into the ambitions of the sins of man, and the call of humanity to overcome them. But how does humanity overcome them? Open your eyes. It's interesting how Ultraman managed to last this long, right? I don't mean from the context of the movie, although it seemed pretty grim from the Mephilas fight. The Ultra series has found its ways internationally, with new fans across many iterations and entries, and impacted pop culture for the better. But the many trials and problems that the franchise had incurred seem incredibly dire. It goes beyond Kaio. It's a property that has many creative minds behind, so many forces who want to deliver something exciting and illuminating to imaginations across the globe. So when any of those forces are moved, it's a ripple effect that stretches in so many ways. Eiji Tsuburaya, the producer and the special effects director, he controlled the presentation and set the stage for how you see this world. You probably already know how the series nearly ended when he passed on. Todo Narita, the artist and designer, he drew out so many of these characters with modernist approaches that create looks that stand the test of time, even today. And then there's Tetsuo Kinjo, the writer. It feels like he's underappreciated in the creation of Ultraman, at least in Western circles. But he has a point of view that made sure that these characters can be in both the context of Ultraman in 1966 and the Ultraman of 2022. This sparked a friendship with him and the Tsuburaya family, with Eiji putting his faith in him to write for a new science fiction show, a project with the title of Unbalance. It eventually became Ultra Q, and the ideological messaging behind many stories was completely intentional. They were influenced by Kinjo's own life. He portrayed power-hungry individuals who strive for conquest and power. He portrayed lost souls who just want to survive, even if it was at the expense of people. These tones only got more prominent in Ultra 7, giving many stories he wrote their iconic status today. It seems that, above all else, Anno and Higuchi wrote this story in mind to give tribute to Kinjo, his characters, and his experiences as someone who was hurt by warfare. They were so effective in their portrayal of criticizing the advancement in war that it called back to the Kinjo-written Ultraman and Ultra 7 in a way that no other entry in the Ultra series since had managed to do. But it's a portrayal that wouldn't be the same without the coupling of artistic sensibilities and design work by Todo Narita, an artist who, at the time of Ultraman and Ultra 7, was severely underestimated by Tsuburaya. He wasn't credited for the creation of the show's monsters and aliens for years. Narita was still someone who fought for his work to be properly credited, and this film is a triumph in properly bringing his concepts to life, as well as giving him the recognition he deserves all this time. Kairi Narita, Toru's son, was deeply moved by Anno's motivation from the 1983 painting, and expressed that he was very happy that Anno chose to draw more direct inspiration from his father's original vision. It's further exemplified by the design of Zoffy, the second being from the planet of light to arrive on Earth, and someone who wants to prevent the Earth from becoming a threat to the universe. Instead of Ultraman's solution of needing to save it with brute force if necessary, Zoffy's solution is to destroy the world. At first, he refers to him as Lipiah, the original name from the planet of light, only to christen him with the name that humans gave him. Zoffy's character is based on early written publications for Ultraman that misrepresented Zoffy as being the controller of Zeton, who appeared alongside him in episode 39, Farewell Ultraman. Likewise, the name of this world Zoffy is spelled differently. The magazine had it as Zoffy, with an extra accent, instead of Zoffy. Zoffy. His appearance is also inspired by the Zoffi that appears in the episode, featuring a black dorsal fin as opposed to Ultraman Silver. Subsequent material interpreted it to be shadowy, so when Zoffi appeared in Ultraman Ace, he featured a mask that was more or less the same as Ultraman and Jack's. And speaking of Jack, one of his original masks was used to model Zoffi's face off of, recreating every detail from it, including his asymmetrical eyes. Going even further with crediting Narita, Zoffi's black and gold coloration comes from a collection of designs by Narita for a tokusatsu series entitled Next. The project never released, but there also exist designs of Ultraman that Tsuburaya commissioned from Narita in the late 80s for Ultraman Towards the Future, entitled Ultraman Shinpen. It's a little hard to translate, but Shinpen means a godly evolution that cannot be understood by human knowledge. Zeton itself is possibly the most radical design from the whole creative team, and early designs wanted to send off Ultraman's original Christian themes by shaping Zeton to be shaped like a crucifix. With the way the weapon glides on the Earth's atmosphere and how its design looks overall, it evokes the same energy that appears from Unit 01 in the climax of The End of Evangelion. It feels right to have Zoffi work as a final antagonist, as the gray morality of those who are in control of the situation is a constant theme. But like what we've seen before, the will of humanity persists and will not perish under these odds. Zoffi comes from a line of other Ultras who don't put Earth as a priority. His speech to Lipiah about the insignificance of humanity in the universe and the necessity of their deaths closely mirrors that of Julie's from the 2003 film Ultraman Cosmos vs. Ultraman Justice. And for those who have read far enough into Eiichi Shimizu's ongoing Ultraman manga, the portrayal of the Star of Light might seem more than just a little familiar. Ultraman leaves Taki with the formula of the Planck brain dimension, which is what the beta system is built around. His letter emphasizes an important theme, not just throughout the film, but for the Ultra franchise as a whole. Even with all his powers and knowledge, Ultraman is not a god. They don't save humanity for the sake of being worshipped or relied upon, but because, more than anything else, they believe in humanity's capacity for good. With Ultraman's trust placed upon him, it's Taki who unwittingly becomes humanity's savior, by working out the last mathematical solution into defeating the Zeton weapon before it destroys the world with a trillion-degree fireball. Kaminaga reconvenes with the team, and Taki instructs him to lap into the Planck brain once again in his Ultraman form to open a six-dimensional hole and refocus the weapon's energy back onto itself, closing Zeton in. The sequence that follows is a breathtaking example of an unimaginable horror. Ultraman and Zoffi speak, with Zoffi explaining that he almost lost him if it weren't for Ultraman's willpower. Ultraman once again states his beliefs, now saying the acceptance of death is the same as the desire of life. Now, Zoffi finally believes in humanity, proclaiming them to be precious beings with an intellect that he understands. But Ultraman doesn't want to go back with him to the planet of light. He wants to give his own life back to Kaminaga. Have you become so fond of humans? What can humanity really do in the scope of the universe? Survive. The hard work of Shinji Higuchi, Hideaki Anno, and the entire team behind Shin Ultraman paid off. The film not only outgrossed every other Ultraman film before this, but it also outpaced Shin Godzilla in profits. I mean, not that money matters that much or anything. It's a sign that this is exactly what people wanted, and signs point to more material of the world of Shin Ultraman being made in the future. If that's not enough, then there's also Shin Ultra Fight, a tongue-in-cheek tribute to Ultra Fight that features the entire cast engaging in Shin Ultraman funny moments. Shinji Higuchi's direction brought something special. His directing reminded us of techniques we haven't seen since the first 3 entries of the Ultra series, while still being completely unique. He brought forth a breathtaking look at a hero we love, while still retaining those key aspects of what makes him great. Hideaki Anno shows that within the many roads a person can take, that even with depression, a cynical look at life, or a loss of hope, there is still light. It can be from the help of your friends, from achieving inner peace, or from Ultraman himself. There will always be something to push you forward, but sometimes we need a giant of light to tell us that humanity is worth fighting for.